A Black History Reader. 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask by Dr.Claud Anderson. Chapter 3, or Part 3. Rethinking Social Integration. Question 11. Has education been the great racial equalizer for blacks? Education is a class issue bound by race and has no magical powers to equalize social and economic conditions between black and whites. Generations of black children were indoctrinated to believe the pathway to success in racial equality was education, just as it appeared to be for white children. Schools have constantly presented a paradox for blacks. First, if fortunate enough to get an education, a tool. They were limited as they could use their tool. There were few places within the black community to apply their acquired educational tools, and if they ventured outside, whites would determine if they were wanted and value of their black labor. This paradox placed blacks not too far from where they have been in slavery. It was still hard for blacks to earn enough to support their families. Education, and generally considered the mechanism for upward class mobility, has been an issue for blacks since the founding of this nation. First, it was against the law and public policies to teach a slave to read or write. Any person caught teaching a slave to read or write would suffer 39 lashes with a whip and fined $100. Following the Civil War, after nearly 360 years of slavery and being denied an education, approximately 5 million penniless, landless, jobless, uneducated, unclothed, homeless, and unprotected blacks were set free to wander the countryside. They could neither read nor write. Some public and private schools were set up by sympathetic churches about abolitionists and individuals to teach blacks, up by sympathetic churches, abolitionists and individuals to teach blacks manual skills and to be subservient. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency to aid the transition of former slaves to life of freedom. Before it became dysfunctional, the Bureau funded what are known today as historically black colleges. Those schools started as elementary type schools, grew and progressed to high schools, teacher colleges, and finally to full colleges and universities. Although 96% of blacks in America were suffering from planned ignorance after the Civil War, they believed in the possibility of an education. They believed if they acquired education, reading, writing, and deciphering, they could overcome imposed ignorance and become a self-sufficient and competitive group. Blacks diligently pursued education in the new schools. Parents went all out to make their children attend whatever school was available, whether public, private, or religious missionary schools. During the 30-year time period between 1866 and 1896, former slaves set an educational achievement record that has yet been to be broken by any racial or ethnic group. When slavery ended in 1865, approximately 98% of black Americans were illiterate. By 1896, blacks had reduced their illiteracy rate by more than half, from 98% to 45%. They educated themselves faster than 26 million Europeans who entered the country during the same 30-year time period, with nearly the same illiteracy rate as ex-slaves. Never in record history has an enslaved race or ethnic group reduced their illiteracy rate by 50% within a 30-year time period. But education was not an equalizer. While blacks were achieving educationally, their expected benefits were not accruing to them. The 26 million immigrants were being installed over them as managing and ownership class. With a lower educational achievement rate than blacks, newly arriving Europeans outdistanced blacks in employment, business, politics, and income. Unfortunately, higher class status and monetary benefits that typically followed academic achievement did not follow black educational achievement. The European whites became business owners, managers, administrators, and prominent public servants. Blacks with greater educational achievement simply became low-level workers and domestic servants. By 1920, blacks again reduced their illiteracy rate, this time by 20%. which was equal to the Jewish and Asian immigrants entering the country. By the 1950s, the national illiteracy rate for black Americans was down to 16%. Yet when the black civil rights movement began in the 1960s, black with a college education did not earn as much as white high school dropouts. Blacks with a college education did not earn as much as white high school dropouts. Blacks Americans in general earned only 0.56%, 56 cents for every dollar earned by whites. In the 10-year period between 1966 and 1976, the earning ratio of blacks moved up to 66 cents for every dollar earned by whites. The nations entered the 21st century with black Americans attaining even a greater educational achievements. However, their income had risen to 56 cents for every dollar earned by white persons. David O. Sears, the author of Racialized Politics, The Debate About Racism in America, argues that whites' accusation that blacks need more education provides a facade for hiding white racism. It misdirects blacks to search for power in educational to propel them into an upward mobility rather than searching for power in economics. Education power is illusionary because socioeconomic benefits did not fully track academic and achievement gains. By the 1950s, a black person with a college degree did not earn the salary of a white high school dropout. Black teachers earned less than half of what white teachers earned. Blacks with 1 or 2 college degrees work part-time as domestic servants in white homes or in the low-paying jobs in white businesses. In 2017, young black college graduates are often unemployed or underemployed. Many grew up believing the myth that racism was a thing in the past, that they all needed was a good education to succeed in life. The reality that racism still exists is a shock to the young people who are trained to be chemists, engineers, writers, physicists, physics, computer programmers, biologists. Their skin color continues to be a handicap for them in the 21st century. Education can only be a potential for upward mobility. The benefits are bound by race, which entraps blacks. Those who manage to get an education generally move up some, but do not achieve the same degree of socioeconomic mobility as whites. Blacks do not have the competitive alternative economic or any place in which to use their skills and training to better themselves or their own group. Blacks need their own communities where they can own businesses and be employed so they can practice group-based competitive economics in a capitalistic society. And their education to number 1 benefit is benefit themselves individually, and number 2, benefit their race. Question 12. What was Murator's manumission, and does it still apply to blacks? Murator's manumission was the legal act of freeing a slave for good deeds, as defined by the national public policy. The term meritorious means something earned. Manumission means becoming free or freedom. During slavery, a slaveholder could grant freedom to a slave who distinguished himself by saving the life of a white person, inventing or designing something that enriched a white person, or snitched on other members of his race, especially those blacks who were resisting and contemplating a revolt. Murator's manumission policies were not intended to unify slaves or make them more self-supportive humans. Instead, the policies were designed to keep blacks non-threatened and under control. Murator's manumission became a public policy in the early 1700s and was introduced into the Virginia legislature as a law in 1710. Incorporated into every aspect of the slavery system, it remained an active current and is sensitive through the social integration process, and it is still an operating principle at this present time. Murator's manumission recognized and rewarded blacks who accept their assigned position, but for personal gain were thwart, openly or nefariously, the efforts by other blacks to alter the racial status quo. The first person known to have received Murator's manumission set the baseline for benefits. Peter M. Bergman, in his book, The chronological history of the Negro said the first person to receive meritorious manumission was a Negro named Will, who was recognized for having impeded a slave revolt in South Carolina colony. He was awarded his freedom by performing a public service. Will's freedom papers provide that he enjoy and have all the liberties, privilege, and immunities or of to be a free Negro. Once the public policy was in place, an endless number of slaves became sensitive to freedom opportunities that they could earn. In the 150 years between 1710 and 1860, black slaves reportedly revealed the plans for over 300 possible slave revolts and insurrection. Slaves warned slaveholders that the general public of the pending revolts in hopes of receiving meritorious manumission in the forms of personal recognition and material benefits. Another notable example of a black person seeking meritorious manumission occurred on the eve of the Civil War. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown and his raiding party traveled to Harpers Ferry, Virginia, to capture weapons for a U.S. Marine Corps armory to use to free black slaves. When John Brown and his party entered the town, a black man who have already won meritorious manumission was sitting on the porch of the railroad station and recognized Brown and his party. The black man, Hayward Shepherd, ran to alert the town that Brown was in town to free the slaves. Brown's raiders shot Shepherd down in the street. He was free to sit on the porch that evening because he was no longer a slave. In gratitude for Hayward Shepherd's outstanding behavior of placing a white society political economic interests above the freedom and needs of a member of his own race, and the town eradicated a monument honoring him. The Hayward Shepherd statue was stored beside the City Major Museum and covered with a wooden box in the 1960s. The inscription on the statue that the town of Harpers Ferry erected to honor Hayward Shepherd read, Hayward Shepherd statue in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Source, author, personal collection. On the night of October 16th, Hayward Shepherd, an industrious, respected colored freeman, was mortally wounded by John Brown raiders. In pursuance of his duty as an employee of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, he became the first victim of an attempted insurrection. This boulder is erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans as a memorial to Hayward Shepherd, exemplifying the character and faithfulness of thousands of Negroes who, under many temptation throughout subsequent years of war, so conducted themselves that no stain was left upon the record, which is the peculiar heritage of the American people, and an everlasting tribute to the best in both races. Meritorious manumission behavior is often observed, especially in the ranks of black elected officials, ministers, civil rights leaders, athletes, and entertainment personalities. These visible people, anointed by others as leading blacks, are sometimes aloof and disconnected from their own race. They are often required to disavow and abandon their own people in exchange for public attention, financial resources, and personal comfort. Once co-opted by the power structure, they are effective tools to be used against or to control the black masses. The divide and conquer scheme makes the black minority even weaker and more exploitable. Blacks seeking meritorious manumission, for instance, will endorse political candidates knowing they will deliver nothing to the black people. They will support integration with any group before seeking to strengthen their own people. Worst of all, those seeking modern-day meritorious manumission believe that the advancement of their own race is wholly dependent on the advancement of the right race and all other peoples of the world. Meritorious manumission opportunities today are typically presented as symbols and incentives for satisfying race relations, such as being asked to support public policies and subordinate the interests of Native Black Americans to the interests of women, LGBT immigrants, and other fabricated minorities. Most black civil rights leaders are elected officials that allow these groups to be equated to the rank over blacks, or seeking their meritorious manumission. So keep your eyes on Fox, CNN, or NBC television news channels and see if you can identify blacks are seeking or in getting meritorious manumission rewards and recognition. Question 13. Does social integration policies have a hidden racial quota? The U.S. Supreme Court 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision mandated social integrations by nullifying state and local segregation laws. But real school integration never occurred. White society pushed back in numerous ways that made the social integration process a radical and symbolic exercise rather than a physical and racial reality. White society views social integration as a threat to their long standing social privilege, skin coloring preferences, and economic advantages. After centuries of being a majority and mistreating the nation's black minority, whites fear becoming a minority with any majority when setting. They view being a minority as being a loser. Worse, as they wonder if blacks would seek revenge against them. Therefore, they pushed back and made it clear that they would accept social integration only on the most minimal of terms that would allow them to continue being the majority in nearly every situation. So, to structure integration rules, they went back to the old Diversity Act, which had a racial quota that requires a white majority over a small black minority in the social and physical situations. The Supreme Court 1960s ruling on Brown versus Board of Education may have signed to end illegal segregation, but skin color remained a factor in immigration policies and still determines who and how many immigrants from a given country are admitted. Considered superior, those with white skin have full entitlement to advantages, privileges, respect, and acceptance in mainstream society, while those with black skin receive something less. Immigrants whose skin color allows them to blend in with this nation, white's majority, are accepted and given access to the nation's resource, opportunities, and political power. In addition to allocating resources according to skin color, whites try to live in communities that have some kind of physical barrier between the racial, like a river, bridge, park, shopping malls, or railroad tracks. If by chance blacks and whites live in the same neighborhood, whites are reasonably comfortable with black neighbors so long as the percentage of black does not exceed 5%. Once the percentage of blacks exceed 5%, a mental alarm sounds, signaling a threat to the community racial balance. Whites become sensitive and on guard to the possibility of a black minority challenging a white population for dominance and majority status. When the black population exceeds 6 or 7%, white flight commences. Whites sell their homes, resign from organization, withdraw their children from public schools, and re-register them in private schools, segregated academies, or religious schools. They move to all-white communities and partake in all-white activities. The same alarm does not go off when the population moving in is Hispanic, Asian, or any other group on probation to become white. Andrew Hacker, in his book Two Nations, and Black and White Separate, Hostile, and Unequal, was more generous with his figures. Hacker felt that trigger quota for white flight could be as high as 10 to 20%. Either way, whites are adamantly opposed to giving up their historical superior and advantaged position in society that allows them to own and control nearly 99% of the nation's wealth and political power. Unfortunately, too many black Americans mistakenly presume that as a result of the surge of non-European immigration that began in 1965, the incoming immigrants would ally with America's black underclass and make the collective group a majority. However, that did not happen. There are no incentives for any immigrant ethnic group to give up its preferred status in mainstream society and align with a powerless black underclass. The dominant white population would also never allow that to happen. Immigrants coming to America from any place other than Africa or the Caribbean islands will and necessarily be classified as white, ensuring that a white majority will continue to maintain numerical dominance over and rule the black minority population. Question 14. Why do blacks need communities instead of neighborhoods? Physical communities and a strong sense of community are essential for surviving and prospering in a competitive group-based society. Today, across America, blacks have neighborhoods instead of communities. A community is where a group lives, works, learns, competes, and thrives. It is where they store their valuables, history, culture, business, jobs, and functional schools. Black neighborhoods are like buckets with holes in them. They are porous and do not hold in things of value. A neighborhood is dysfunctional, crime ridden, impoverished, and transitory in nature. As world societies become increasingly more competitive and nationalistic, for the survival of Black America as a group, it must also become competitive by a functional community. When the first European immigrants entered the country, one of the first things they did was build their respective ethnic communities within they live, work, learn, compete, and thrive. As the integration movement of the 1950s emerged, white ethnics became fearful that blacks would move into their small ethnic communities and overwhelm them. So they rallied around their strength and their greatest commonality, which was not ethnicity, it was their skin color. They sought to strengthen themselves against blacks in social integration by abandoning their separate ethnic communities and assimilating into a larger group, the national community of oneness and whiteness. Then, a national community, they were able to protect themselves from Black American march towards social integration and colorblind society. Just like European whites surrendered their ethnicity, came together and built a nation-wide community, Black Americans could come together for a group strength as a national black community and cease pursuing social integration. However, to convert neighborhoods into communities and bring back blacks who no longer live in black neighborhoods, the targeted areas must have certain things. Community tree of life. Source Polynomics in America. The following are the key elements to a community that you must have. Number one, support those who do not live there but identify within and support the physical community. An alternative. Number two, an alternative. Wholly independent businesses district that produce goods, service, wealth, jobs, and business opportunities for its own residents and supporters. Three, an undefined code of conduct that condition residents to protect, respect, care for, buy from, and support members of their own community. Number four, a form of governance with public officials and community representatives who advocate for and defend the collective interests of the community once it's established, and most importantly. Number five, a functional black community must be marked and identified with distinctive signs to denote that it is a valuable and closed to destructive activity such as drugs, prostitution, garbage dumping. Marking a community occurs when towns, buildings, street signs, expressways, airports, parks, and public statues are named to reflect the community's residents and their culture. Before the integration process began in 1950, blacks had notable towns and quasi communities, which, if nurtured instead of destroyed, could have been functional communities. They were in the Harlem, New York, Black Bottom in Detroit, Watts in Los Angeles, Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, and many more throughout the country. When in those communities, blacks operated business, schools, churches, and social organizations. They stored wealth, cultural artifacts, jobs, history, political capital, business opportunities, spiritual values, middle class values, and produced black leaders. Blacks patronized, cared for, and worked with their own people. Jim Crow segregation had a positive side for blacks. It provided a nurturing place for their quasi communities and the business culture of other institutions stored inside. They were not perfect, but these quasi communities were valuable and were at a midway point in development. De jure laws forced blacks to have a sense of oneness and internal cohesiveness. It was during segregation that blacks, businesses, and industries bloomed across the nation. 100 years ago, during Jim Crow segregation, blacks reportedly owned 10 times more businesses than they own today. Social integration stripped blacks' communities and removed the physical places where all classes of blacks could live and work together, whether they were doctors, teachers, bus drivers, business owners, lawyers, or janitors. Today, blacks do not have the role models, next door business ownership, the jobs those businesses produce for their own people. And they are no longer in control of their culture because they no longer have communities or a sense of community. In such a state, it is difficult, if not impossible, for black Americans to communicate, organize, or compete as a team. Racism is a team sport, and competing in a race-based society must be a team effort built around a group's strong self-interest and need for self-preservation. Unlike black Americans, Non-white non-white immigrants see the value of coming together as a group and do not pursue the scattering integration progress. They know there is strength in camaraderie in numbers. Instead, newly arriving immigrants aggressively seek out their compatriots, old friends, and families to form social and commercial networks. Their ethnic enclaves become culturally protected markets from which they draw business, financing, a school, a skill bank, and a consumer support group. An ethnic enclave or physical community gives a group or a primary area in which to aggregate their businesses, cultural products, and employment opportunities. As an example, when Vietnamese refugees arrived in the U.S., the federal government, in an effort to encourage social integration, physically scattered the Vietnamese immigrants in settlements throughout the country. It was difficult for the Vietnamese to adjust and assimilate as a new minority in a majority white society, according to Richard T. Schaufer's book, Racial and Ethnic Groups. The U.S. government attempt to socially integrate the Vietnamese refugees failed because the refugees sought out their compatriots and reunited, built their own communities, and once again established the sense of community they had in their home's country. Where individual Vietnamese lived outside of the Vietnamese physical community, their sense of community energized them to commute long distance to support and purchase products for Vietnamese owned businesses and maintain social and religious connections. Their communities gave them a place to grow and gain strength. The second and third generations may assimilate into whiteness, but they gain strength from remaining connected to their group. Residential areas in which blacks are majority populations ought to model their communities using ethnic immigrant enclaves as models. Without communities or a sense of community, black businesses will have no primary consumer market for their products and services. Unlike neighborhoods left open and abandoned, black communities should be marked, closed, and monitored. Just like Beverly Hills, Chinatown, Koreatown, or Little Mexico, marking and closing a community signifies not only a sense of pride and security, but also connotes that it is a valuable turf. Once closed, ethnic enclaves are culturally marked. For instance, ethnics may mark their turf by changing the names of buildings, erecting statues, or displaying signs and symbols that reflect their culture. In urban centers in which blacks have been dominant populations for centuries, made streets and the buildings are named after prominent slaveholders. Blacks rarely mark or close their territory, allowing access to interlopers who are able to disrespect and exploit their area. Before blacks were able to move into white neighborhoods, they enjoyed some of the benefits of black cohesiveness. They built and operated their own community-based business districts across the nation. Though black business districts may have been smaller than white business districts, they provide a number of jobs, product, service, pride, and safe sanctuaries for blacks. When the integration progress began, many blacks did not see the value of staying together as a group, pooling their resources and buying from their own businesses, nor did they see the greater political and economic importance of having their own community and business districts. So they allowed those valuable foundations to be destroyed in the name of social integration and political correctness. They jumped on the bandwagon with white liberals. They jumped on the bandwagon with white liberals who convinced them it was better to be in close physical proximity to whites than to each other. They choose to be politically correct and voluntarily destroy the positive foundation of the black communities that they had worked so hard to build for themselves after slavery. Today, it is amazing to see the opinion makers against pushing a political correct view that proclaims that all classes of people are equal to black Americans, and there is nothing special about how blacks have been historically treated in this country. The reality of the matter is that as a group, blacks are locked onto the bottom rung of the social and economic ladder. They are scattered and they are not like any other group. Blacks are a special people with an exceptional history. Black Americans need functional residential communities and business districts in which to gain and store wealth and political power. Strategies for community building are discussed in my book, Powernomics, the National Plan to Empowerment Black America. Question 15. Should Black Americans practice social economics as a team? Group-based social economics is essential for success within a race-based competitive society in which blacks are overburdened by poverty and powerlessness. Wealth and power follow numerical dominance, and in a society the majority wins. Therefore, blacks must ethno-aggregate or pool as a great number of resources as they can, whatever the category, consumer dollar votes, economics, and work together as a team. Remember, racism is the power of one group, whites to control the lives and opportunities of another group, blacks. The word racism came from the economics of slavery. The economics of social injustice, racism imposed on blacks because of their skin color are now institutionalized. Blacks must work together as a socio-economic team. Although the historical and social construct can co-sign blacks to the lowest level in society, they have a chance to win if they organize into a functional socio-economic team totally committed to gaining group political wealth power, just as whites and other groups have done for centuries. But there are obstacles. Contrary to the socioeconomic practices of other groups, many members of the black race don't want to play as a team. Too many people prefer to support other teams rather than their own team. They are adverse of their own skin color uniform. There are also some blacks who take pride in denigrating and sabotaging efforts of conscious blacks who struggle to socioeconomically elevate the black race. Such inappropriate behaviors impede blacks from winning a team-based competition or even getting scores on the socioeconomic scoreboard. In a race-based society, team playing is essential, and the groups with the best team chances of winning will be those that keep most control of their own fate and fulfill their self-interest first. From this country's very founding, whites have prospered politically, economically, educationally, and racially because their team spirit has empowered them. Whiteness is a unifying concept defined by the social construct as the race that holds group-based power that can be used over outgroups like Native blacks and Native Americans. The central purpose of the social construct on race was to enrich only members of the white team with wealth and power. The white team, remembers, were classified as the first-class citizens. Blacks were classified first as property, later as a second-class citizen, lastly as a group that refuses to play as a team. Although whites have historically operated as a scheme color team, they have had an underlying foreboding that one day blacks might wake up and also begin playing as a race-based team. The racial social construct required that whites operate as a team for mutual tangible and intangible benefits. Whites as a team established the slave trade, crafted the nation's founding documents, maintained black subordination and Jim Crow segregation. Whites denied and controlled black education and kept blacks illiterate for centuries by design, oversaw the legal and extra-legal organization that abused and criminalized blacks, regulated the political system, Wall Street, stock markets, nearly all major businesses, the media, real estate, and international affairs as the white team. The white code of conduct was so powerful that blacks could never be any more, any less than the white society needed or wanted blacks to be. Consequently, whites play as a team with an accountability code of conduct. To the contrary, blacks play as individuals with uneven team spirit and no code of conduct. As a result, blacks have yet to win a game whether they compete against gender, ethnic, or simply poor white groups who play as a team. Knowing that power and wealth tends to follow the numbers, whites generally prefer to interact with blacks by keeping them as a non-threatening, non-competitive minority. As an example, when the prospects of the integration of professional sports arose, whites, fearful of integrating existing professional black baseball, basketball, and football teams into existing white professional leagues, the social integration process meant black sports teams were required to disappear, to disband, and to release hundreds of the best players in the sports world so the white players could dominate and their teams could hire one of two black players. Politics offered another example. White fear of blacks as the team permitted major political decisions. According to a national poll on the eve of Civil War, 98% of whites were fearful and of opposed freeing black slaves. After the Civil War, whites in the North did not want ex-slaves to migrate north. A century later, 75% of white Americans were still opposed to and felt blacks were moving too quickly into social integration. Recently, in 2010, national opinion and public attitude polls indicated that 63% of whites and other groups had a negative feeling about blacks and did not want to be around blacks. While there are black-white friendships on an individual basis, the majority of whites oppose and are fearful of the advance by blacks as a group. Liberals generally conceive of progress in race relations as one-to-one assimilation of deserving black individuals. However, in a race-based society, wealth and power align with the numbers and follow the social construct on race. While whites venerate individualism, they play as a team. They individually contribute to the power and influence of the white team. Blacks, on the other hand, do not play as a team. Individuals do not work for them in the same way it does for whites and other groups. Social construct on race is historically restrictive. It allows blacks to benefit only individually and is an exception. It will not allow individual blacks' accomplishments to lift the group out of its bottom status. Blacks were enslaved, impoverished, and made powerless as a group. Therefore, individual black accomplishments, while important, did not make it easier for the group to compete in the marketplace, the political arena, or any other place in which group. Solidarity is in strength. Individual black accomplishments tend to stray just that. The benefits do not accrue to the group. Now is an opportune time for blacks to change the social construct on race and to choose a new path in order to achieve new outcome, one of the prosperity and unity. They must acknowledge their history and make their own sustained effort to chart a new reality for themselves and their children. That was the intent of Powernomics, the national plan to empower the Black America, to offer a guide to purposeful change based on the group-based strength and competitive advantages. Immigrant groups such as Asian, Hispanics, and Arabs are an outgroup for a short time. They demonstrated socio-economic teamwork in the way they link their businesses to their physical communities and to a sense of community. It is beneficial for blacks who wish to build a strong competitive team to study the success of immigrant groups who practice nationalism and cooperative economics and model a number of useful practices that blacks could use to create a new social construct and build a social economic team. To build a social economic team, the following strategies could be useful for blacks if, number one, think of your group as a nation within a nation in America. 2. Reduce consumption of goods and services produced and sold by competing groups and increase spending with black-owned businesses. 3. Build businesses and industry around competitive advantages of the group. For example, blacks are the only source of black hair. Therefore, their team should control the entire black hair care industry from manufacturing to salon and other retail sales. Similarly, blacks should have vertical control of music they create from production, distribution to all music halls of fame. 4. Increase individual savings and create group savings mechanisms such as in investment clubs or SUSUS, money pools or information loan clubs, common in the Caribbean and the Asian communities. Pooling resources and dominating in business wherever you dominate in population or consumer spending patterns are Powernomic principles that can guide Black Americans to success as a social economic team. It is the only way that Black America can work within realities of racism and transform the historical economic disadvantages of being black into advantages. Question 16. How are demographics changing in major black urban cities? In the 21st century, the majority white population is in the midst of recapturing urban cities through a combination of gentrification, privatization, immigration, initiatives used in urban cities to displace blacks, to push them those who remain into the minority status with no power. Major political and economic efforts across the nation are systematically redeveloping those cities into comfortable havens for affluent whites and ethnic immigrants who are taking over the assets of urban cities. Since the early 1980s, city planners took the lead for social conservatives and initiated specific projects to attract whites under the guise of attracting new money to major urban centers, which had become majority black during the 1960s, 1970s, and civil rights movement. The key strategies of gentrification and privatization offer returning whites incentives such as cheap residential and commercial properties and ownership of control of public-owned assets, bridges, museums, school buildings, airports, bridges, golf courts, parks, waterfront properties, and anything that could be used to generate capital. The blacks elected officials, business leaders, ministers, civil rights leaders, celebrity often cooperate with and encourage these assets transfers from black controls to white control. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago and in the black-dominated cities across the nation, it is easily observed that the socio-economic conditions have caused life to regress to a jungle-like existence. Many hold the disquieting belief that black Americans squander their chances to build, maintain, manage urban cities, but there is more to the story than the contemporary snapshot. After riots, racial disturbance, and the integration movement took hold about 50 years ago, whites began to flee urban areas to secede control. They moved their families to the suburbs and took with them everything they owned. Blacks began to regain limited control over those cities, but white flight had drained the essential resource. By the time blacks took control, the cities were weakened and poor. Although abandoned by whites, urban cities are situated in desirable locations with many natural assets such as rivers, ports, and other amenities, which led to their selection as major population centers in the first place. Whites eventually wanted to regain control, and that process is the full swing. The first generation of black urban politicians that had control of the cities came in the mid-1960s. For the most part were determined pro-black personalities, but they did not have the resource to manage and maintain the cities. The following generation of blacks elected officials tend to have colorblind attitudes and began to work along with whites who wanted to regain the cities that they have given up. The most successful strategy to recapture control of the cities was to ignore black city dwellers, to elect black and white officials with colorblind attitudes about race. Invoking concepts such as minority diversity and colorblind in people of color makes any form of blackness invisible. Blacks do not seem to notice that when politicians use the colorblind strategies, blacks are not even mentioned. They are ignored and, for all practical purposes, disappeared except for photo ops. When blacks disappear, then politicians and developments can literally be colorblind. The sleight of the hand trick is performed in full view of blacks who are watching, but do not seem to notice that they no longer exist. When black elected officials inherit control of the urban cities amid white flight to the suburbs, the urban centers began to deteriorate because of the scorched earth policies. Fleeing white took everything that owned and controlled out of the cities. Black mayors inherit the cities, but not the financial resources. All but the first generation of black mayors also lacked the vision to use the opportunities to build those cities into strong black competitive economies. In addition to white leaving the city, related social phenomena began to weave into the pattern. The Highway Transportation Act of 1956 routed and built expressways right through black business districts and black communities, destroying them. A few years later, urban renewal more popularly could black removal finished off of black business and in the black middle class communities in the cities. As whites moved, blacks became the majority population and elected black mayors and city councils. Black mayors did not destroy the urban cities. The white response to integrations did the trick. The immigration onslaught started at about the same time after the 1965 Immigration Act. The immigrants from Mexico, South America, Asia, and Pacific Islands flooded into the cities and further displaced blacks in what had been their communities. The black middle class had many pressures. With their business and homes demolished, they made the choice to abandon their own cities, their own people, their land they controlled in the city, and the potential for building competitive black businesses. industries, and functional communities capable of practicing capitalism. They followed the white middle class into suburbs that surrounded major urban cities. The exodus of the black middle class left the black masses leaderless, divided, and incapable of competing with an influx of ethnic immigrants. These social forces will make black Americans and minority underclass in what were once majority black urban centers. It is unlikely that a second chance for control will ever happen again. As whites return to revitalize urban areas, they will flush black out and force them to age in suburbs, which will become the new black ghettos. The combined effects of gentrification and privatization in urban centers will fix blacks in the ranking orders at nearly the same level they were in 100 years earlier. Whites and other ethnics who receive approximately 98% of black Americans' annual disposable income take comfort in the non-competitiveness of black Americans and are reassured that racism and the nation's social construct is working as designed.